For 15 years, the Alpha King and I argued through letters. Then his wolf refused to leave my side. A true story. The letter sat on the table for 3 days. Nadia had a system for this. She had the system for 15 years, and it had worked fine for 179 letters, and there was no good reason for it to fail now. The system was simple. The letter arrived. She set it down. She went about her day. She tended the herbs, dealt with whoever came to the door needing something, fed the goat, argued with the goat, made dinner, sat by the fire, slept. Somewhere in all of that, at a time of her choosing and not the letters, she would pick it up and open it. On her terms, in her time. 3 days was not unusual. 3 days was well within the range. She had once waited 12 days, during a particularly difficult week, and the letter had been there when she was ready, unchanged, patient in the way that letters always are. This letter, though, every time she sat at the table it was there. Every time she stood at the window it was in her peripheral vision. It had taken up a specific quality of space that objects should not have, the way a person takes up space, heavy and particular, and aware of itself. She had set it at the corner of the table where it would not be in the way. She had moved it twice, small adjustments, telling herself she needed room for other things. The seal was pressed in dark wax. The color and the specific way the wax was stamped had not changed in 15 years, and she knew it from across the room the way you know a sound you grew up hearing. Before you name it, your body has already recognized it. The handwriting of her name on the outside was not the same as it had been for the previous 179. That was the thing she had noticed immediately, and then tried not to notice, and then noticed again. The M in her name leaned differently. The pen had pressed with a different kind of attention. She could not explain this in terms that made sense for someone who had never met the writer. She knew it the way she knew, from the color and texture of a root, whether it had been grown in wet soil or dry. This letter was different. She did not open it. On the 3rd day she sat down across from it at the table and looked at it properly, not as something she was about to open, just as an object. She stayed with it the way she would stay with a plant she had not yet classified, clinically, without urgency. She lasted about 4 minutes. Then she pushed back from the table, went outside, and found something to do with the goat. To understand how a woman ends up arguing by letter with an Alpha King for 15 years, you have to understand a specific kind of father, not a bad man, a scared one. There is a meaningful difference. Nadia's father had lived his entire life in a border settlement, and border settlements teach you a lesson very young. The people with power pass through here. The only way to survive that is to not give them a reason to stop and look at you too closely. Cooperate. Submit the forms. Pay the levies. Smile and nod and keep your head down, and maybe they will leave you alone. He signed the treaty in the next room while Nadia was standing in the kitchen listening to the scratch of the quill. She was 23. She had been a healer's apprentice since she was 12. She had opinions about medical supply chains, about administrative oversight of community health resources, about who got to decide what was stockpiled and what was not. Those opinions were loud and well-reasoned, and they lived entirely in her chest, because there had been nowhere safe to put them. She did not blame her father. She blamed the treaty. The terms were, on paper, reasonable. The border region healers would submit monthly supply tallies to the Alpha King's administrative court. What came in, what went out, what was kept. A resource management arrangement, ostensibly designed to prevent shortages and waste. Practical, sensible, the kind of thing you could read in a treaty document and feel entirely fine about. She put it on and it sat on her like a collar. She spent the first month being very correct about it. She submitted the tally on time. She documented everything precisely. She did not editorialize. The form that came from the court, requesting the first tally, had spelled belladonna with 1 N. She corrected it in the margin. She told herself it was just a spelling correction. She had corrected spelling errors on medical documentation her whole working life, because wrong spellings created real problems. If you wrote belladonna and someone without botanical training tried to find it in a reference index, they would not find it, and that mattered. It was professional. It was not a statement. It was not the beginning of anything. The response came 2 weeks later. It was not from the court administrator. It was in a different hand, cleaner, sharper, more deliberate. The first line identified it as coming from the Alpha King's direct office, which was a strange result for a spelling correction to produce. The second line said, with a particular crisp quality she would come to recognize over 15 years, that editorial comments on administrative forms were outside the scope of the arrangement. She read it twice. She picked up her quill and wrote 4 lines back. The first line acknowledged his point. The second disagreed with it. The third explained, in specific medical terms, why accurate botanical spelling was not editorial but functional. The fourth offered, if he remained unconvinced, to provide documentation from 3 separate reference texts. She sent it before she could think better of it. He wrote back 6 lines. She wrote back 9. He wrote back 14. She wrote back 14, as well, which she did not think was a coincidence on his part. By the end of the month they had covered the original spelling, its medical implications, whether administrative forms should be standardized against reference texts, which reference text should be used, a side dispute about Eastern versus Western botanical authorities, and whether anyone in the court's procurement office had any practical field experience with the plants they were naming. The tally had been submitted, on time, alongside all of this. She started keeping the letters. By year 5 there was a box. She had not meant for there to be a box. It became one the way things do when you cannot throw them away and have not decided what else to do with them. By year 10, there was a second box. She had started a tally in year 3, not of the letters. She kept a simple count of those, 179 prior to the current one. The tally was of the arguments. Who had won, what the margin was, her categories. A clean win required him to concede the point in writing, explicitly. These were rare. She had 12. A working win meant the subsequent letters showed him applying her position without acknowledging the shift. She had 46 of those. A partial win meant the policy outcome had landed closer to her position than his, even if neither of them had formally conceded. 36. The losses she wrote in a smaller hand, not to hide them. She was not vain about the tally. She wrote them small because she preferred them small. They took up less room on the page. They were harder to see at a glance. Standing score after 15 years. Her side, 94. His side, 41. 22 draws, which she disputed. The thing about letters, the real thing, the thing she had not anticipated at 23, was that they gave you the version of a person that existed when they were not performing. In a room, people perform. They manage their faces and their tone and the impression they are creating. In a letter, if you write long enough and about things that genuinely matter, the performance falls away. You can hear the real shape of a person's thinking, the things they reach for first, the places where the argument thins because they are uncertain, and the places where it gets dense because they are not. She knew his thin arguments and his dense ones. She knew that he had 3 ways of opening a letter, and she could read from the first 2 sentences which mode she was getting. She knew which topics he returned to without being asked, and which ones he avoided, and what the avoidance meant. She also knew, with the quiet certainty of someone who had been paying close attention for 15 years, that he knew the same things about her. You do not exchange 179 letters with a person without them knowing you. You can tell yourself the subject is water rights, or botanical classification, or the ethical obligations of a healer to a territorial authority. The subject is always, underneath, the person. She sat on the floor by the open floorboard in the lamplight on the 3rd day of not opening the current letter and counted all the way to 179. She got to 179 and stopped. She put everything back and pressed the floorboard down and stood up and made tea and looked at the letter on the table. She did not say anything to it. It did not say anything to her. She drank her tea. 3 days before the Alpha King arrived, his wolf came. She was outside checking the east edge of the herb garden. Something had been eating the fennel, and she had a strong suspicion about the goat, which the goat was denying with the sincere expression of an extremely guilty animal. She heard the sound first, low, not threatening, more like a large thing settling into stillness. She turned. The wolf was at the edge of the path. Enormous, silver gray, the exact color of ash from a beechwood fire. A scar ran along its left shoulder, old and well-healed. Its eyes were pale and steady, and it was looking at her with the full, calm attention of something that had been looking for a specific thing and had now found it. She looked at it. It looked at her. "No," she said. The wolf's ears moved forward and then back. Not alarm. Something more like, "I have heard that. It is not a relevant variable." She tried several things. She told it to leave. She described, at some length, why it could not stay. She looked for a collar. There was not one. She looked for injury, or illness, or signs of distress. There were none. She looked for the behavior of a young or confused animal that had wandered off from somewhere. This was not that animal. This was a creature old enough and settled enough that it had long since moved past the category of things that make mistakes. It was here because it had decided to be here. She gave it water because she was a healer, and giving water to things that needed it was reflex, not invitation. It was inside by nightfall. She did not track the exact moment of transition. One moment the wolf was on the step. The next it was on her floor. She had either not noticed or had looked away at the critical moment, which was a thing she occasionally did with facts that complicated her existing arrangements. She did not sleep as badly as she expected. This was the first strange thing about the wolf. The second strange thing was that its breathing, slow and vast, like a bellows in a stone building, was easier to sleep next to than silence. The third strange thing was that by morning it had moved closer to her bed without asking. She looked at it. It looked at her. "If you are going to be in here," she said, "I talk while I work. I am not going to change that." The wolf looked at her. She went to make her morning preparations. She talked while she worked. This was not unusual for her. She had talked through her work for years, to the plants, to the jars, to the mortar and pestle, to whatever problem she was trying to work through. Talking to the wolf was different in a small and specific way. The wolf listened back, not with human comprehension. She was a practical woman, and she knew the difference. But there was a quality of attention. When she said something that mattered, the wolf's ears moved. When she moved through the room, its gaze followed. When she sat down, it occasionally stood and came to wherever she was, not to investigate, just to be adjacent, and then went back. She named him Ash on the second day. In her head only. She was not a person who named things aloud that she was not yet ready to be responsible for. By the third evening she was talking to him the way she talked in letters, not at him, with him, about the supply request from the eastern village that was off. The wrong things, the wrong quantities, suggesting stockpiling she could not explain. About the root system upstream that should not have been there. About whether it would be a hard winter or a merely difficult one. And then, sitting by the fire on the third evening, with her hands around a cup that had gone cold. "He is coming, is he not?" She had not meant to say it. It came out as a statement, not a question, because she already knew the answer. Ash raised his head from his paws and looked at her. "You did not get lost," she said. "You are not confused. You came here on purpose, which means either he sent you, or you came and he knows you are here. Either way he is coming." The wolf put his head in her lap. Just like that, the full weight of it, heavy and warm, no negotiation. She went still. Her hand found his neck without her deciding to put it there. The fire was low. The goat was making small settled sounds outside. The letter was on the table. She sat there with her hand in silver fur for a long time. He came at mid-morning on the fourth day. She heard the horses, and the specific sound of a retinue trying to be understated and not entirely succeeding. She put down what she was holding. She straightened the work table, not because it needed it, but because she needed something to do with her hands for 30 seconds. Then she went to the door. She had built a version of him over 15 years, from letters. This is unavoidable when you correspond with someone long enough. You construct them from what they give you. She had built someone sharp and formal and capable of irritating her across a distance of several territories with a single subordinate clause. She had built someone precise, someone who argued in good faith and sometimes lost badly and sometimes lost gracefully, and she could tell which was which by the weight of his sentences. She had not built someone this tall. She had not built the quality of stillness he carried, which was not the stillness of a person with nothing to say, but the stillness of a person who had learned to carry a great deal without letting it show in how they moved. She was not going to examine any of this. "You should have written ahead," she said. "I did write ahead," he said. "The letter did not specify a date. The letter specified that I would require lodging during the territorial circuit. The reasonable interpretation is that I would arrive at some point during the circuit." "The reasonable interpretation of requiring lodging," she said, "is that you include a date so the person providing the lodging can prepare for your arrival." "The reasonable interpretation of a territorial circuit," he said, "is that exact dates depend on conditions. Conditions change. And yet here you are." Conditions apparently allowed it. They looked at each other. Ash was pressed against her leg, and for the first moment since the wolf had arrived she thought, "Oh, this is whose he is. This is the person his wolf came ahead for. He came 3 days ago," she said. "I know. He has never done that. He did not seem lost. No, he has never done that either." She stepped back from the doorway. "Your escort can make camp at the east edge of the settlement. There is a well and shelter for the horses. You can have the back room." She went inside. He followed. She did not look back to see his face. What happened over the next 3 days was the most brutally, exhaustingly, surprisingly interesting argument of her adult life, and she had spent her adult life arguing with him. On paper it was different. On paper you could think before you wrote. You could cross something out. You could sleep on it, decide against the cutting thing, write the gentler version instead. You had time, distance, the comfort of knowing the other person could not see your face. In person, he could see her face, which she was not pleased about. She had a face that did not always do what she told it. The first morning they argued about water allocation. This subject had a history. It had come up 3 times in the letters, and each time had produced an exchange lasting several months. In person it lasted 2 hours and covered ground the letters had not reached, partly because in person you could interrupt, and she did, and he did, and she found that neither of them interrupted badly. They interrupted at points of genuine disagreement rather than to fill space, which told her something. She won the water argument on points. She knew she had won it when his counter-arguments shifted from substantive to procedural. A switch she had learned from the letters meant he was buying time to reconsider. She did not say she knew this. She let it conclude naturally. He told her the upstream data was incomplete. She told him it was more complete than his, because hers was collected in person, on the ground, with boots and a satchel, and actually speaking to the people who lived there, whereas his came from reports submitted to his court by administrators who had not. He was quiet for a moment. "You have been to the upstream settlements," he said. "Several times. That is outside your territory." "Yes," she said. A pause. She poured more tea. The argument moved on. On the first afternoon, they covered pack hierarchy ethics, which was a topic she had opinions about that she suspected he found aggravating, and he had authority on that was not helping him win this particular argument, and Ash lay on the floor between them and looked at the ceiling. On the first evening the argument ran out somewhere around hour 9, and they sat on opposite sides of her fire and were quiet. She was aware, with the careful awareness of a person trying not to be aware, of where he was in the room at all times. She kept her eyes on the fire. He said, "The first form you submitted, you corrected the spelling, it was wrong. I know it was wrong. That is not what I am saying." He was looking at the fire, not at her. "I thought you were trying to make me angry. Were you?" she said. "Angry." A pause. "No. I was interested." She put her eyes back on the fire. "Nobody corrects forms," he said. "People submit them and they move on. They resent the forms in private and they say nothing. That seems very efficient of them. It is. You were inefficient. The spelling was still wrong. Something happened in his face at the edge of her vision. Something sitting just under the surface, deciding whether to surface. She looked away before she could see whether it did. On the second morning she said something about the nature of obligation to a settlement versus obligation to a crown, and he said something back that stopped her mid-sentence. She finished the original sentence because she was not going to reconsider in front of him, but she sat with the new version privately, turning it over. On the second afternoon, they were both reaching for the same page in her notes, and her fingers touched the back of his hand. She pulled back. He said nothing. She said nothing. Ash looked at both of them from across the room with the expression of a creature who had decided not to get involved. On the third morning, she was sorting the supply ledger in the back room when she heard him come in from outside and stop. He said her name. In 15 years of letters, her name had appeared approximately 1,040 times. It started every letter. It appeared mid-letter when he was making a specific point. She had read her own name in his handwriting more times than she could count. She knew his handwriting's version of her name the way she knew her own reflection. She had never heard him say it before. She came out of the back room. He was standing at the work table with her real ledger, not the treaty tally, the one she kept for herself, the handwritten one that went back 15 years and was not for anyone else's eyes. He was on page 3 of 12. Ash was beside him. The first time since the king had arrived that the wolf had chosen to stand next to someone other than her. She noticed this and filed it away. "That is a private ledger," she said. "Yes," he said. He turned a page. "You have been redirecting supplies. My tallies are accurate. Your tallies account for what leaves your settlement. This is what you do with it after." He turned another page. "These villages are not in your territory. No, some of them are in mine. Yes, the eastern allocation was cut in year 3 of the treaty. I know, it was a budget decision. I calculated the winter mortality numbers for those villages without a consistent supply chain. I chose to disagree with the decision." He turned another page. He set the ledger down. Not abruptly, he set it down the way he did everything, with a deliberateness that was not carelessness and not performative care, but something that lived between the two. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. "You never told me," he said. She felt the sentence before she said it, the edge of something she was about to step off. "You never asked." He heard what was in it. She could tell because of what happened to his face, a shift she had been learning the vocabulary of over 3 days. She looked at the window. Outside was gray and ordinary. The goat was doing something audible. Ash pressed against her hip. The sentence he said was, "I need to review the eastern allocation." The sentence underneath it was something else entirely, and she had 15 years of experience reading his punctuation, and she knew what it was. She did not sleep that night. This was not unusual for her during difficult stretches, but the difficulty of this particular stretch was specific in a way that made it worse. She was tired, with the tiredness that comes from holding something at arm's length for too long. She had been not thinking about the letter for 6 days and not thinking about his presence in her cottage for 3 days, and the sum of all that not thinking was sitting directly in the center of her chest where she could not reach it. She got up. She cleaned things. She reorganized the herb shelf in a system she knew she would probably undo by morning. She stood at the window for a long time. The thing she was not thinking about was very simple. It was so simple that she could not understand how it had taken 15 years to arrive at it, and she could also completely understand, because the easiest things to not see are the ones that have been in front of you the entire time. She had been talking to this man for 15 years, not the official version, not the administrative version, the version that wrote back 4 lines when she corrected a spelling error, not because he was required to, but because he wanted to. The version that had opinions about things that mattered, and some opinions about things that did not, and she could tell the difference by the weight of his sentences. The version that argued in good faith, and sometimes lost badly, and sometimes lost well, and she had long since learned which was which. She knew him. That was the fact she had been not looking at. She knew him, in the particular and private way you only know someone whose words you have been living with for a long time. Not his face, until 3 days ago, not his hands, until the first morning, but the shape of his thinking, the texture of what he cared about, the places where he was certain and the places where he was not. And he knew her. That was the other half of it. You do not exchange 180 letters with a person without them knowing where your seams are. She had 15 years of evidence that he read her the same way she read him. She had spent 15 years at the exact distance where you could be known without being reached. He was in her back room. She stood at the window until she was tired enough to go back to bed. She lay down. She looked at the ceiling. Ash's breathing came from the floor, slow and even, like a river running. She sat down, carefully, in a place she could find later, the sentence he had not said. She slept. He was packing when she woke. She could hear it, the quiet, efficient sounds of someone who had learned to move through mornings without disturbing the people around them. She lay still for a moment listening. Then she got up and made tea and brought him a cup, because she was a practical person and he was leaving in an hour. They sat at the table. The 180th letter was between them. It had been there all 3 days, without either of them naming it. He looked at it now. 6 days, he said. I have been occupied. You open letters the same day they arrive, within the hour usually. When one goes more than 5 days without a response, I know something has happened in your settlement. She looked at him. You track the timing. I notice patterns. Yours is consistent. He looked at the letter. This one is not. The handwriting is different, she said. She did not look at him. The address. The way you wrote my name. The first 179 were consistent. This one you pressed the pen differently. I can see it. I cannot explain how I can see it, but I can. You can see it, he said, because you have been reading my handwriting for 15 years. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then, open the letter. I will open it after you leave. Why? Because I have 15 years of practice opening your letters alone. I would like to maintain that arrangement. Something happened in his face. She looked back at her tea. I wrote it, he said, before I decided to come. I was not sure I was going to send it, and then the circuit brought me through this territory, and it seemed easier to come rather than send it. Easier, she said. Yes. You found it easier to travel across 3 territories in autumn than to send a letter. Nadia. I am just noting the fact. For the record. He looked at her with an expression she would have recognized immediately in writing, and could not quite read on his face. Not because it was unfamiliar, because it was too familiar, and having it in a face instead of on a page made it harder to look at directly. Open the letter, he said again. After you leave, she said again. He accepted this. He finished his tea. He stood up. An hour later he was ready. She walked out with him because it would have been strange not to. His escort was assembled and quiet at the east edge of the settlement. His horse was there. Ash was sitting on her step. The king said the wolf's name. Nothing. He said it again, with an edge of authority in it, not harsh but clear, the way you speak to a creature with which you have a long-established understanding. The wolf's ears moved. It looked at him. Then it looked at the middle distance, which was not in the direction of its king. One of the escort guards shifted in his saddle. Nobody spoke. The king said the name a third time, differently, not command, something more like asking. Ash stood up. She thought he was going to go. He took 3 steps toward his king, and then he stopped and turned and came back and sat back down on the step and put his head against her knee. She kept her hands at her sides. She did not touch him. The Alpha King stood by his horse for a long moment. He looked at the wolf. Then he looked at her. She kept her face neutral. She was very good at keeping her face neutral. She had 15 years of practice. He has never refused, the king said, quietly. Not for the escort. I know, she said. He seemed certain about it. He has been certain about you since the first night. She looked at the wolf, who was not looking at either of them. His chin was against her knee. He was not going anywhere. This was not a creature that was lost or confused. It had made a choice, and was sitting in it, with the same unhurried certainty it had sat in her doorway on that first morning. He is not lost, she said. No, he knows where you are going, yes. So this is not confusion. No, the king said. It is not confusion. They were both being very careful about the words they were choosing. She noticed this. I will leave him, the king said. He will find his way back when he is ready. They both knew this was a fiction they were agreeing to. The wolf was not going to wander back. He was going to stay here because he had decided to stay here, and the king was going to permit it, and neither of them was going to say out loud what that meant, because they had not yet found the right words for it, and saying it wrong would be worse than not saying it at all. He mounted his horse. He looked at her one last time from that height, in the gray morning light. Open the letter, he said. She said nothing. He wrote out, She stood in the doorway with his wolf against her knee and watched until she could no longer hear hooves on the road. She waited until she was sure the sound was entirely gone. Then she went inside. She picked up the letter. She sat down at the table where they had sat for 3 mornings arguing and drinking tea and being, in a way she had no previous name for, entirely themselves. She sat in her chair. The other chair was still slightly pulled out from the table. She did not move it. She opened the letter. It was 7 lines. She read it. She sat with it. The fire had burned down. Outside, the goat was making small, satisfied sounds. Ash's breathing filled the room from the floor beside the table, slow and even. She read it again. She folded it along its original creases. She went to the floorboard and opened the first box. She looked at the 179 letters arranged in it. Then she looked at the one in her hand. She put it on top, not in sequence, not in order with the others. On top, separate, its own place. She pressed the floorboard back down and stood up. She sat down on the floor. She did not often sit on the floor, but she needed to be somewhere lower, and she needed something solid at her back, and the floor and the wall provided both. Ash moved from where he had been lying and came and put his head in her lap without being asked. She put both hands in his fur. She did not cry. She was not a crier. She had not come from a crying family, and she did not intend to start now. What she did was sit on the floor with the wolf's weight in her lap and look at the low fire and be with the 7 lines. She thought about 15 years of letters. She thought about a man who had written back 4 lines when she corrected a spelling error on a form, not because he was required to, but because he wanted to. Who had been wrong about red clover for 15 years and had never, not once, put that in writing even after she had proven it twice with full citations. Who had sent his wolf 3 days ahead of himself? Who had sat at her table for 3 days arguing in exactly the same way he argued on paper, which was the same way she argued back, which was not something she had fully understood until she was in a room with him and could see it working in 3 dimensions? Who had picked up her real ledger and looked at 12 years of redirected supplies and said, "You never told me," with an expression she had been learning the vocabulary of for 3 days and now had enough words for. He would not have stopped her. She had heard that in the pause before he set the ledger down. The way she heard his meaning in punctuation after 15 years of practice. She thought, 181. Then, there is no comfortable number that comes after 181. She had been comfortable at 179. The distance of 179 was a known distance. 181 was a different kind of number. 181 was the number where things change. She sat on the floor until the fire needed tending. Then she stood up and tended it, because there was always something that needed doing. She built it back up. She put the kettle on. She stood at the window and looked out at the settlement, ordinary and quiet and going about its morning. "Do not look at me like that," she said. She had not looked at Ash. She had known he was looking at her without looking. He put his head back down. She made her tea. She stood at the window with it. The morning was clear and cold, and she looked at all of it, the rooftops, the road, the frost on the ground, the way you look at something when you have just decided something and the decision is still settling warm in your chest and you are not quite ready to call it by its name. 181. She drank her tea. Ash stayed for 2 more weeks. She stopped expecting him to leave. She organized her days around his presence, the way you organize your days around a river, not fighting it, just accounting for it. He slept at the foot of her bed. She slept better than she had in years. She did not examine this. She wrote the 181st letter on the 6th day after the king had left. She sat at the table for a long time first. She had the quill. She had the parchment. She had 15 years of habit, which is a heavy and familiar thing to pick back up after a person has been in the room with you and then gone. She started with water allocation. New numbers. He was still wrong. She wanted that on record. She wrote for 2 hours. At the end, before she sealed it, she added 1 line that was not about water or allocation or anything they had ever argued about. She sealed it before she could take it back. 3 weeks later, the response came. She opened it the same day it arrived, which was not the system, and she was not going to acknowledge that this was not the system. She read through the water argument, which he continued to be wrong about, but wrongly now, in a way that showed he had looked at the upstream data she had cited, which meant he was thinking about it properly. She read to the end. At the bottom, before his seal, were 2 lines. She read them twice. She sat very still. Then she put the letter in the box, in order, in its proper place with the others. The 181st. She did not know, sitting at her table that afternoon with ash on the floor, and the fire going well, and the settlement quiet outside, what came after. She did not know about the 182nd arriving in person instead of by post. She did not know about the site visit she was not expecting to have company on. She did not know about the second time Ash would leave with his king and come back with him, and the way the escort would make camp somewhere further out, and what it would be like to argue about water rights with someone sitting across from you in the evening instead of across a territory. She did not know any of that yet. What she knew was this. The letter was 7 lines. She had put it somewhere specific. Ash was warm and present and chosen. The fire was good. The morning asked nothing of her. She picked up her quill. She began the 182nd letter. She was already looking forward to being wrong about something together. End.